go. Firstly, I should say apologies, begin with an apology that I've put this night on what is State of Origin night, and I had no idea, which I don't know for people in the AFL states, I don't know how much of a thing that is. And that for you guys across the ditch, I don't know how much of a thing that is, but you know, I'm at least going to fly my colours tonight to let you know where I stand on that matter. And if we finish at 8:15 as planned, we should be ready in time for second half. So that's the plan, which is, you know, the key moment. Tonight is the first in a 6-part series, Christianity versus Capitalism. A bit of a provocative name for a series. Why this series? Why are we doing this? Why does it's a topic Manna Gum has talked about a fair bit. Well, then the genesis of this webinar series was really from a webinar I ran about this time last year, which is really presenting my PhD thesis, which is entitled Christian Witness in the Midst of Capitalism. Yeah, so which I finished, well, late the year before, so I presented it last year to Manna Gum folk, and it was kind of a harrowing experience actually, trying to present your thesis in a webinar, and I'm not sure I did it very well, but I had a few comments from people afterwards saying they'd love to hear more. So Clint Bergsma, who's online here from WA, wrote me an email saying he'd like to hear some more on some of those topics. And that was kind of a red rag to a bull for me, really, because, you know, I always feel frustrated by not being able to get into enough depth. So this is really the genesis of that. So I hope it works, and if it doesn't, well, it's Clint's fault. So why capitalism? Why is that a topic that we keep banging on and about? Because well, essentially, capitalism is, in my view, a key concept for understanding our times, for all sorts of things that are happening in our times, both socially, culturally, economically, ecologically, politically. It's part of that mix of all of those things. But it's also a highly contentious and confused term, capitalism. Needs a lot of clarification. I think it can often just be an unuseful term when used unwell. So that's one key object in this webinar series. It's also a key concept, as I'm going to make clear in on other nights in this series, for understanding Christian faith and what it means to be faithful and to witness in these times. We need to understand capitalism. We need to understand capitalism to understand what's happened to Christianity in the last 500 years. So we'll get into all of that stuff. All right, I'm going to begin sharing my screen. Okay, can everyone see that okay? A PowerPoint project. So what is it? This is our first session on the history and character of the capitalist world system. And so the following, this will be the progression of the series, and the series it really is a progression of ideas. So it's a building set of concepts, but I hope that you'll be able to jump in when and if as you can, that you don't need to do the whole series for it bits to make sense. So this one, we're really talking about trying to figure out what this word means and how we locate it in history and how it's behaved. In the second session, we're going to be really trying to think about what we're going to describe tonight, to think about that in biblical and theological terms. In the third night, we're going to be asking more closely about the relationship between capitalism and Christianity within history, which is a very important topic for us. In the fourth night, we're going to be asking, really digging down into the controversies around the economic outcomes of capitalism. about whether it lifts people out of poverty or creates poverty, whether it reduces inequality or increases inequality, all of that sort of stuff. And the fifth night, we're going to be thinking specifically, bringing it down to right down to our level, thinking for people in our part of the world. So I think we're all in Australasia here. What does it mean to witness to Christ in the midst of a capitalist world economy? And the last night we'll be thinking about the ideas of imagining post-capitalism, thinking about some political ideas in our time, what they may look like. So that's where we're hopefully going to go. So I'm going to talk tonight for, try and talk for about 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes. And hopefully we'll have, well, the remaining time, 20 to 30, somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes for questions and answer. So Jacob Garrett is with us tonight. He's going to facilitate the question and answer session. And so I think there will be options to either speak your questions, turn your mic off and do that, or you can write them in the chat room and Jacob can moderate those. So we go with the question time. We want to try and restrict the questions tonight to the subject matter of tonight, because we're going to cover a huge field of area from theology to ethics to practical questions over the series. So I don't want to get into any of that stuff tonight, because we're going to eventually deal with those things more satisfactorily later. But Jacob can talk you through that when we come to the Q&A part. All right, well, take a breath, because I'm going to launch through a whole bunch of material, which I hope I can do in a timely manner. As I said, it's a red rag to a bull getting onto this topic for me, so I always want to go into more detail, so I'm going to try and be disciplined. In Exodus 16, we have that story of that comes after the liberation of Israelites from Egypt, and that great story, which is a foundational story of biblical economics. And it's the story of the manna in the wilderness. And it's a story that begins with a certain amount of perplexity. The Israelites pick up this substance from the ground and they ask in Hebrew, manna, what is it? They don't know what it is. And it's interesting and ironic, perhaps, that tonight we're going to be talking about the economic system that's almost the polar opposite of the manna system. And yet we have to ask the same question. What is it? We need to describe it. And really, Exodus chapter 16 and much of the rest of the Torah goes on to try and describe what a manna economy looks like. And we're going to be doing a similar or the inverse task for the capitalist world system tonight. What is capitalism? So we have to begin by just frankly admitting that there is simply no settled definition of capitalism. You can consult different dictionaries or Wikipedias and textbooks. They'll give different versions of what capitalism is. Very quickly, the term evolved from the word capital in 15th century Italy. So it's a word that came from the Latin word for basically for capita, for head of stock, but a word for counting stock that became transferred into thinking about financial stock in 15th century Italy, to think about capital as something to do with money. By 17th century France, we see this word appearing, capitalists, to describe people who are amassing capital. And it usually had a slightly derogatory tone to it, to talk about a capitalist. It's not until the 19th century that the word capitalism first arises. And it's really a word that's coined by, I'm using this term very broadly, the 19th century socialists, who are a very diverse group of people. and they were wanting a better economic system, what they called socialism, and they needed a term to describe what they were against. And the term that they coined was capitalism, some sort of ism system that's related to capital. And it was inherently, from its beginning, a term of critique. Contrary to popular opinion, it wasn't Marx who came up with the term, or Engels. In fact, they didn't even use the word capitalism in the Communist Manifesto. They talk about the capitalist mode of production, and that's his preferred terminology. It's not really until Max Weber writes his renowned treatise, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, in 1907, that the word capitalism gets launched on its, fully launched on its modern career. And it gains in 1917 with the Russian Revolution a ominous notoriety, which it didn't really have until then. So from then, capitalism was always, after that point, thought about in relation to what was seen as its opposite. It became hard to talk about capitalism without talking about communism. So that's something of how the term has evolved. But actually, if we push further, we think about what capitalism is, it's simply what I'm calling, a fancy word here, a historiographical construct. So historiography is really simply the stories or narratives that we tell to try to describe history. And capitalism is something, a word that people have come up with to try to describe something they have observed in history. It's a way of describing large and momentous movements. So down below, you can see an engraving from 17th century, the 17th century Netherlands, which is really a social comment on the economic system that people saw emerging. They were observing a change in their economic world, and they described it as big fishes eat little fishes. That was their way of trying to capture it. The terminology of capitalism is trying to do a similar thing. It's trying to capture a change that's happened in the social and economic world. We have a bunch of other historiographical constructs we use all the time. Feudalism, the Renaissance, mercantilism, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution. None of these things are actually things. They're just terms that we use to describe a large change that we think of can see happening in history. So although capitalism comes in the form of a noun, it's really just an adjective trying to describe something. And some historiographical constructs do that better than others. So present day historians rarely these days use the term mercantilism, and less use the term feudalism. But the terms the Renaissance, Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, and capitalism are all going strong. So what have been some of the key descriptions of capitalism as a historical phenomenon? So I'm going to give you the three big ones tonight, those of Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and Max Weber. So Adam Smith was the author of The Wealth of Nations, one of the great books of the modern era. And Smith is seen by some as the father of modern capitalism on both the left and the right. And so if you're on the left, on the right, he's the great hero or the prophet of capitalism. And if you're on the left, he's perhaps the great, the child of Lucifer, something like that. But he's seen as someone who thought it up almost. So Smith was writing in the 18th century, and he was addressing the context of what he saw as, and he called the emerging commercial society he saw in Britain. And he is famously described it as this propensity in human nature to buy, truck, and barter one thing for another. And Smith's big task was to describe the seemingly providential operation of markets and how governments should behave in relation to them. Now, if you notice, I've put Adam Smith in scare quotes up the top, because actually, I don't think Adam Smith was describing capitalism at all, even though he is very commonly understood to be so. And there's lots of people who, as I said, see him as the father of modern capitalism. I think he was actually describing something different, but that's probably a story for another night. Karl Marx certainly was talking about capitalism, and his great manifesto was Das Kapital, published in 1867 in German, and I think not really translated into English until the late 1880s. By some, he's really seen as the owner of the concept of capitalism. Some people think really, if you're talking about capitalism, you must be a Marxist. I think no, there are people who have long suspected I'm a Marxist because I talk about capitalism. I'm going to tell you tonight I'm not, and some of the reasons for that will become clear. There's many reasons why I'm not, but just on sheer basic historical grounds, I disagree with Marx, even though there's a lot that he has contributed to our understanding of capitalism, and his contribution and genius has to be recognized. So Marx really thought of capitalism. He was writing in the 19th century, and the key thing he was addressing was the context of the Industrial Revolution and the increasing social inequality that he could see. And so Marx primarily thought of capitalism as a mode of production that is relating to industry, and it was based on the alienation of the workers from the means of production and from the product of their labor. That means workers didn't own the tools of their labor anymore. They were just employees, what's described as proletarianization. So really for Marx, capitalism was synonymous with industrialization. Max Weber, writing on the other hand, was really coming from a different perspective, and he was much more interested in some of the intellectual genesis of capitalism. And he's seen by some as explaining the origins of capitalism in the Protestant Reformation. Now we're going to, in one of the later series, and we're going to, of this episodes of this series, get into Max Weber in detail, so I won't say too much more about that. Other than that, that's not quite an accurate characterization of what he was saying. But Weber was primarily trying to address the context of what he called capitalist rationality. That is, he saw capitalism primarily as a way of seeing the world, as a way of seeing the world that measured everything by an economic standards of efficiency and output, what he described as an iron cage. Tonight, I'm going to propose to you a different way of thinking about capitalism that draws on all of these three thinkers, Smith, Marx, and Weber. Each has to be, their enormous contribution needs to be recognized. So I'm going to be sharing to you some from the world systems theory perspective and how it talks about capitalism. So world systems theory is a whole body of literature. It's got many different elements to it, but three of the most prominent authors are those you can see on the screen: Fernand Braudel, Immanuel Wallerstein, and Giovanni Arrighi. And they have centrally been concerned to trying to describe capitalism as a historical system. So what does capitalism look like from a world systems perspective? So one thing they're keen to stress is that capitalism is not or should not merely be a synonym for commerce, business, trade, and profit making. I think there's a very common confusion is to think about anything to do with profit making or commerce as capitalism, or extending from that, anything to do with a market economy to do with the capitalism. A market economy must be capitalist, and capitalism involves market economies. Likewise, it shouldn't merely be a synonym, as Marx used it, for a mode of production, for industrialization. They thought capitalism required a much bigger description than just that. And finally, another common misconception is that capitalism shouldn't be mistaken as some sort of economic ideology, such as a free market ideology, or neoliberalism is a term that's often used as seen as interchangeable with capitalism. So free market economic ideology and neoliberalism are really forms of apologetic for capitalism by people in a particular place in a particular time, but they certainly don't stand as an accurate representation or description of what capitalism is, and especially not how it's behaved historically. In some ways, they're actually quite inaccurate for that. So, what is capitalism within a world system's perspective? So, as I mentioned, it's firstly just a way of describing something that's being observed in history. So it's a question, we're dealing fundamentally with a question of how we read history and how big a frame we need to read history with. Capitalism is a term that can be used to describe the behavior or the ethic of individuals, can be used to describe the behavior of firms or corporations. And it's also a term that can be used to describe the behavior of nations. But it really comes into its own within this body of work as a terminology for describing an economic system as a whole, what we will call a world system. And I'll explain in a moment what we mean by a world system. So first, let me just give you a beginning operating definition of capitalism, and then we're going to fill this out historically in a moment. So to begin with, when we're talking about capitalism, we're talking about, at a very basic level, a system of accumulation. That's very simply right at the heart of it, a system in which capital is employed for making more capital, the reproduction of capital. It centrally involves the mechanisms of the market, but as I'll come to explain, it shouldn't be conflated with the market. So markets are essential to capitalism, but capitalism is not essential to markets. And within the capitalist system, the rights of property, i.e. capital, are and must be dominant for it to be a capitalist system. To just simplify that same definition into a two-point definition, we could simply define capitalism as an economic system that is characterized by endless accumulation and relentless commodification. So commodification describes the process by which more and more things are brought into the sphere of the market so that they can be bought and sold. So let me say briefly now what a world system is, because it's an important concept for describing what capitalism is and how it's behaved. So within world systems theory, a world system describes a large integrated economic unit that's largely self-contained. So here is a picture of the 8 circuits of the 13th century world system from one of my favorite economic history books ever by Janet Abu-Lughod. And it's full of maps like this, which is great. So this shows you in the 13th century, the world characterized essentially by a series of world systems. Now, they're not neat categories. You can see they overlap a lot. But within each one of those circuits or circles, you could, for argument's sake, say that 90% of economic activity that happens within those circuits is largely based on internal processes, and maybe only 10% relates to external processes. So there is connection between world systems, but they're largely self-contained units. What was happening in the 13th century was that the significant achievement of that century was that they were increasingly connecting these world systems. It was a period of very precocious connection. And these were all, to some extent, largely commercial world systems or had large commercial elements to them, but none of them were capitalist at this stage. Just hold that thought and I'll explain it more fully. Just to zoom in to the European part of that. So here's Europe in the 15th century. So this is medieval Europe before capitalism. And it's a hodgepodge of principalities and overlapping sovereignties, and the Catholic Church is part of the mix of the whole thing. Medieval Europe is characterized, we could say, by its economy is embedded within the social and political fabric of life. So economic transactions are very much subordinated to the social and political system, however we might describe that. So feudalism is one term. It's a bit too simplistic because it was a bit more varied than that. But economic life was basically subordinated to serving the needs of social and political life. We can also say that economic life was governed by what we might call a moral economy. That's a view, a moral and cosmological view even, of what an economy is for, what economic life should, the purposes it should serve. And these were underpinned by the economic teachings of the medieval church, which had quite a lot to say on economic life. Now, that was by no means unproblematic, and there was a lot of hypocrisy involved. It would be easy to paint a way too romantic picture of the 2 points I've just mentioned. But the significant thing to say is that there was, despite all the disparate things going on in Europe at that time, there was a common essential moral, at least in ideal terms, a moral touchstone of what people understood an economy to be about and for. In Europe at the time, so as I've mentioned, it was politically fractured, and it was also quite competitive. So there's lots of these principalities going to war with each other, and dynasties struggling against each other. In the bigger picture of those world systems you saw before, Europe was actually quite economically fragmented and backward. It was a marginal on the world scale in comparative terms. That's compared to this picture of the so once you get to Islam and also to the East Asian circuits of the world economy, they're much larger, more sophisticated and integrated. It's
That's 30 minutes, John.
Sorry?
That's 30 minutes.
Okay, cool. Okay, I think we're going all right. Yeah, I asked Jacob just to give me a time check so I don't get too carried away. So it's worth just spending a little bit of time looking at a historical counterexample, which helps us understand the rise of capitalism a bit better as a historical phenomenon, something that's arisen from a particular time and place in history. And we get a good picture of that by looking at imperial China between the 13th to the 18th centuries, which is the Song, the Ming, and the Qing dynasties, with the Mongols in between there for a short stint. So over this period, there is simply no doubt about this. It's widespread agreement. China represented the world's largest, wealthiest, most technologically sophisticated market economy. I'll say that again, most sophisticated market economy. It was characterized by a complex and intensive division of labor. That is what some people have called an industrious revolution. That is, they had a very the economic system was split into all sorts of specialized little bits, how we often think about industrialism, but it didn't involve what we call the machine industrialization, but a very complex division of labor. Now, we're used to thinking of Europeans being the world leaders economically, but actually historically that's a very recent phenomenon. Right up until the end of the 18th century, the center of gravity of the world economy was unequivocally with China, and perhaps in between China and India, actually. So in these pictures below, you can see on the left-hand side a picture of a thriving market scene in China. In the middle picture, you can see paper money from the Song era. This is in the 12th and 13th century. So that the Chinese were the first people to invent paper money. And if you read about it, historians often talk about the paper money system in China as a failure, but it lasted for 300 years and was widely used, which is longer than our current paper money system. So if our paper money system was to collapse in the next 50 years, no one would say it's been a failure right now. So it was actually quite a successful system. And on the right-hand side is a very interesting book that Giovanni Arrighi's written around. His view is that when Adam Smith wrote his book on the wealth of nations, actually the poster child of what he saw as commercial society was actually China, but that's another story. So here are some interesting characteristics of imperial China that we'll compare to Europe. One, it was imperial. It was a unified political system. It wasn't a fragmented political system. And that, as you'll see, is critical. Because it was a unified political system, it worked to suppress capitalist interests. And that's because rising interests of money are always seen as a threat to the interests of power. And so the imperial system in China, historically, again and again, when some economic players got too big, the emperor would step in and often quite brutally just pull the rug out from under them. And that happened again and again throughout Chinese history. Over the long term, it's what one economic historian, Robert Wong, has described as a pro-market and anti-capitalist economic system, which is fascinating. It's not a concept we're used to thinking about, a pro-market and anti-capitalist economic system. So what about Europe? How and why did this thing called capitalism develop in Europe? And I'm going to date it in what some people call the long 16th century, between 1450 and 1650. So really, I'm not going to try and give you a single cause. I think that's a fool's errand trying to find a single cause for the rise of capitalism. I'm just going to describe to you what a series of the factors were that really formed a perfect storm. So this was a period of enormous change in Europe, a whole bunch of things going on in the realm of society, economy, and politics. And they involved things like, particularly following the end of the Black Death in the 14th century, the end of serfdom. So, and that basically what that meant was that two things that had been tied together, land and labor, became separated and basically became markets. So you could buy land on a market and seek labor on a market. They became commodified. That was a basic, not sufficient, but an important step towards capitalism. Another key part of the story was the economic successes of the North Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, and Florence. In those circuits of the world economy, they were tapping into Islam and through them into the East Asian world economy and doing very well out of often learning from them their commercial techniques and bringing trade from the East into Europe and profiting very well. In fact, it's via them, through Islam, that we get Arabic numerals that we use today, and via them that we get compound interest and things like that. So these, the North Italian city-states were incredibly successful. They punched well above their weight. So Venice, at its height, had an annual revenue comparable to the whole Kingdom of France, which is crazy. And these city-states were also central to the development of, in the 15th century, gunpowder technology and the military revolution. And remember, gunpowder technology came from China, although it was never developed in China in the way that it became to be used in Europe. So there was a whole bunch of changes happening on the military technology side of things, and that had to do with basically the ongoing and very vicious military struggles between these North Italian city-states. And they were also, through this whole process, developing what forms of international finance, much of which they are learning from Islam, and some of which Islam was learning from India, actually. But they were becoming increasingly developed and increasingly sophisticated in Europe at this time. We also see in this period the rise of what I'm calling competitive national states. So what was that really messy map of overlapping principalities and overlapping sovereignties of Europe before really firms up into these large units of nation states: France, England, Spain, Portugal, that much bigger, much more solid entities and begin in competition with one another, a military competition. It's a time in which, as I've mentioned, new commercial technologies are being developed, double entry bookkeeping, compound interest, Arabic numerals, forms of corporation, new forms of corporation are being developed, and other things, not to mention transport technologies. It's also the period of what we have been called the discoveries. So in 1492, Spain begins through Columbus, the colonization of the Americas. Columbus, by the way, was a Genoese, and that whole thing was financed by the Genoese. It was really a Genoese business concern, the colonization of the Americas to begin with. In 1498, the route to the east that was discovered by Portuguese, Vasco da Gama, and they got plugged into the high voltage routes of the East Asian world system through the spice trade. And that was transformative for the European economy too. And then the other thing that happened at this time in the 16th century was the Protestant Reformation, which had a lot, and the wars of religion that soon followed. And that was all tied into also the rise of the competitive national states. It's a very complex history. I won't try and explain all of that, but just to say all these things were happening at once. So the outcome is by 1650, Europe was a competitive interstate system locked in a capital-intensive military struggle. So that's that gunpowder technology I mentioned. Down below, you can see one of the pictures of the 30 Years' War, which is a horrendous and oftentimes brutal war, particularly just turned regions of Germany into a desert, really. So they're in this life and death struggle against each other with this new technology changing all the time, and which requires lots of money to pay for it. So this is central to the system. To pay for this military struggle, you need capital to pay for all the cannons and the soldiers and the uniforms and the foods. You got to fund and feed all of these armies. And in a competitive system, everyone needs to grow. It's literally an arms race. So here's William McNeill's, I think, very succinct description. Europe, in short, launched itself on a self-reinforcing cycle in which its military organization sustained and was sustained by economic and political expansion at the expense of other peoples and polities of the earth. So that begins the story of what is really the story of capitalism as colonial expansion. So if everyone needs to grow in this European system, they go looking for more places to grow. And that's the driving force behind what comes to know between colonialism. So here's a few images to tell that story very quickly. There's the world in 1492. You can see Portugal has a few scattered possessions down in that region of Southwest Africa. But that's it. 1754, it's changed radically. 1822, it's changing again. And then 1914, on the eve of the First World War, the world looks like that. And I'm afraid in just those last two slides, the changing colour of Australia and New Zealand tells the huge story of what happened to our countries, and especially for the Indigenous peoples in those countries. So let me say some things about the evolution of capitalism as a world system. So it's been a system that has of increasing complexity and size and scope as it has evolved, incorporating more and more of the processes of capital accumulation within itself. That means it's drawing in more and more things within the economy, within society, and within ecology into this whole process of accumulating capital. That's what's going on. by the mid-19th century, the capitalist world system had swallowed all other world systems. So that's pretty much by the conclusion of the Opium Wars, when China is drawn in, and then the embargo on Japan by the US a decade or two later. The whole world is eventually brought in, and we end up in a new position when there is only one world system on the planet. And to this day, the capitalist world system is the only game in town. Each new phase of capitalism's development has been driven by what I'm calling a hegemonic leader, someone who is really at the forefront of pushing things forward. So in the early stages, that was Venice and Genoa, particularly. In the next stage, that was the Dutch really pushing that forward. Then it was the British Empire. And in the post-war period, it's been the United States. That era is coming to a close. A lot of people think United States hegemony has already ended. We're now witnessing a struggle for hegemony in the world system between China and the US, and it's still unclear where that's going. So we're coming towards the close here. So last few slides here, I'm going to try and sum up the characteristics of the capitalist world economy. Firstly, it's a system that's been driven by a competitive growth dynamic. That's what I've been trying to describe. Always seeking, it needs to expand and it needs to intensify in order to grow. It's taken place within a competitive interstate system. So that's one of the key differences within the Chinese system, which was always just a single state. Europe, as the capitalist system, never took place within a single state, but always happened as an interstate system. And in that way, the rise of capitalism and the rise of the modern state has been symbiotic. They're not the same thing, but they have co-evolved. Say more about that in a second. Contrary to Marx, capitalism is not characterized at its core by an interest in industry and production, but by finance. That is, by pure money, essentially. Right, and that's been from its very earliest stages, and it's remained so all the way through to the present day. And capitalism has been characterized by what I'm calling a vertical integration of the different geographic regions of the world. So an unequal exchange between some regions that we might describe as the center or the core, and others which are the periphery, and some which stand sort of in between those, the semi-periphery. And here's a map which provides a simple visual representation of that. This map is, I think, way too simplistic, and it's also out of date. But at least it's a starting point for thinking about what core periphery looks like. Let me just this is my final slide, I promise, a last go at describing the characteristics of a capitalist world economy in a different way, in a perhaps more morally consequential way, summing up all of what I've said. So firstly, what I've already mentioned is that capitalism is a system of endless accumulation and relentless commodification. It's a system of ungoverned governance. That is, it's a system that governs the behavior of firms and nations even, and of individuals, but which is itself ungoverned. No one controls it. No one thought it up, and no one's got the reins. Even the hegemonic powers are only the people at the spear tip of capitalism. They're not the people, they don't have control of it. Capitalism is characterized by the great inversion, what Karl Polanyi wrote as, instead of economy being embedded in social relations are embedded in the economic system. Things have been turned upside down. It's characterized by this dialectic of capitalism and the state. So these two things that are in the modern world are codependent, and yet they're also the biggest threat to each other. That's an interesting dynamic. So if what's the biggest threat to capitalism? It's the state and vice versa, and yet they also need each other. Similarly, there's this dialectic between capitalism and markets. Markets are essential to capitalism, but capitalism is not essential to markets. And yet, although markets are essential to capitalism, capitalism tends to, over the long run, undermine the integrity of markets. That's maybe something could fill out in question time. Very simply characterized is capitalism is characterized by the polarization of reward. That means all the benefits flow to the top, whether that's in the geographic sense or the social sense or both. It's characterized by the centrality of abstract value. So when I said finance, I mean, we're really talking about the most abstract forms of money, that dollar sign. And as some people have pointed out, the dollar sign, it is an empty sign. It points to nothing other than itself, but it subordinates all other values within its own valuation, even though it's worth nothing itself. Fascinating concept for us to think about in our next episode of this. Second last, capitalism is characterized by, this is a term from Karl Marx actually, by a metabolic rift in nature. That is, capitalism is almost like a digestive system whose digestive juices act like an acid, like a solvent, turning ecologies into commodities. So capitalism is a force from the very, very beginning for reorganizing world ecology. And finally, what's really important to stress for our ongoing, the rest of our series, and perhaps the weakness of the world systems terminology, is that it might give the sense that capitalism is more than it actually is, even though it's enormous and had enormous impacts in the world. It's not omnipotent. It doesn't have all power, and it's not omnipresent. It doesn't get into all the spaces and all the social relations of the world. And that's important to remember. There are air pockets out there, and we'll be talking about those, some of those possible air pockets. And I think that brings me to my conclusion. So I think I did actually pretty much on 45. Pat myself on the back. There you go. So we might go over to questions and answer now. So we'll throw over to you, Jacob. I'll stop sharing so we can see you all. Do you want to say again how you want to do this, Jacob?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. So if you haven't seen, you can go back through the slides that Jonathan's been working through. I posted them in the chat. So if anything in there jogged your memory, but you didn't get a chance to note it down, or you've forgotten it from something that came later, have a look, think about what you might like to ask a question about. And as Jonathan mentioned, the questions tonight, we're going to try and keep them focused on the material of tonight. So later weeks, we're going to cover different topics. So if you have a question about, say, the inequality wrought by capitalism versus the idea of rising tide lifts all boats that occurred to me, that's probably for another week rather than tonight. So keep your questions on sort of historical development of capitalism.
As much as we can.
As much as you can.
Recognize we're going to have plenty of time to talk about religion and all the other stuff.
Yeah. And if other people don't ask anything, you can probably slip in your slightly off-topic questions as well.
Yeah.
So put your hand up or submit in the chat, and whoever's first, I can just chuck to you. If anyone's got anything to kick off, just go for it. Ramsey House, I see you. Please unmute and ask your question.
Hello. There's quite a few of us here in the room. So we're from New Zealand. And I was wondering, you sort of touched on that Adam Smith is maybe not describing capitalism. What is Adam Smith describing?
Yeah. So he uses the term commercial society. So he actually doesn't seem to know the term capitalism, which is interesting. So it's interesting. So that's quite I guess it requires probably a longer explanation than I should give. But essentially, Smith is reacting to what's been what's described as the previous economic age of quite strong control of the economy by societies, a mercantile society, some of which he saw as for good reasons, others for quite bad reasons. But actually what he's arguing for is, so he's generally seen as arguing for a freer economy. And so these days he's generally been taken to mean being a free market ideologue, but actually you have to put Smith's ideas of wanting to see a commercial economy thrive in the context of his much bigger social and moral economy. So Smith was writing in the context, his previous book that he thought was actually much more important was his theory of moral sentiments, which described basically how he thought people should governed and behave towards each other. And he basically assumed most people, although he probably wasn't a Christian himself, he really was still shared basically Christian assumptions about morality. And he thought that these just do and should govern people's economic behavior. And that was a no-brainer to him. But he also thought governments should play their role in regulating that too. So he wanted a commercial society that was perhaps characterized by a lot more basic freedom for the small guy, if you like, to be involved in the, to live out their economic life. So he was quite against big interests, what he called the stock jobbers, the people who we might call the capitalists. He saw them as dangerous players in the economy. So it's probably a whole nother webinar, but yeah, there's quite a growing body of people thinking that what Smith was describing was not capitalism at all, but actually should be seen as something quite different. And actually, if we had the sort of society and economy he was describing today, although it's by no means perfect, I think we'd be in a lot better place than we are right now. Hope that answers some of your question. And welcome to you guys from New Zealand, by the way. Great to have you here. Hi, Bruce.
So you can use the hand raise function on Zoom, or you can raise your hand the old-fashioned way and hope that I see you, or you can just unmute and jump in if you're feeling bold. Caleb, go for it.
Hello. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question about the difference between markets and capitalism, because I did some undergrad economics and that seemed to be one and the same thing. I guess when they taught it, and I think that's a really interesting distinction.
Yes. So really important concept. And that's largely because, we've grown up in an economic world in which markets have been in the context of capitalism. That's the only world that we've known in which, so the reason I gave the example of China, and it's not the only example we could give, but it's a very good example of, so China through the 13th to the 18th centuries, of a market economy. So that's an economy characterized by markets, lots of players, specializing all different functions, buying and selling, and you can see the operating to markets, to the signals of the price mechanism. So that's how so the thing that defines a market is a price mechanism, which controls, how people supply, how demand and supply work. And so there's been quite a lot of studies done on economic history of China, and you can see the price mechanism working. It's although a vast area of land it's covering. You think about the forms of transport at that time. The price mechanism was operating from north to south and east to west, which tells you it's a highly integrated system. And yet it's remained throughout that time a system of small players. So you don't see over that whole period what you see happening in Europe, which is the rise of massive economic concentrations of power. So in Europe, so like the Fuggers, who were a German banking house who had as much money as some states. You don't see that in China. So it's a market system, So all the things we see happening in markets, buying and selling, trading, market mechanisms, incentives, those sorts of things. It's a regulated system, so it's being regulated and taxed by government, but it's not capitalist. You can make a similar case for the economic system of the Roman Empire in particularly from the 1st century through to the 4th century, that it's becomes some people describe as an advanced agrarian commercial economy. So characterized by price. You can see the price mechanism working across the Roman Empire in that time, but it's not capitalist.
Is it like an aggressive or militaristic attitude that underpins that makes it capitalist? Is it the focus on accumulation?
It's the focus on accumulation. It's the idea that this thing just has to grow. So it's no one's idea. It's the nature of the system that took hold. And this is, I mean, we're quite thinking about what a system is. It's something that gets into a pattern of behavior that has that just has developed its own dynamic, really. So the sum is greater than the parts in that sense. So I've described, so in Europe, it was a central part of that story was the competitive military struggle. It's not the only part, but it plays a key part in driving the need for states to raise capital for themselves. And because they need to raise capital, they need to foster the interests of capital all the time, so that they can raise capital, so that they continue to compete with each other. So they're all doing that, and then that's a growth system. Fair, I think, as a.
So Jonathan, is that what prevented China from becoming capitalist? Then is not having that militaristic drive. Like, why did China not become an accumulative economy?
Very simply, it was under a single political system. So you didn't have a competitive political system operating. So one of the just accidents of history was that Europe happened to be these series of political units who were of roughly equal weight. No one won. No one could win in that, so Spain had to go, France had to go, the Habsburgs had to go, but no one could. Napoleon had to go again, but no one actually could turn that thing into an empire. So they all basically counterweight. Whereas in China, that was one single system that lasted for a few millennium, and it was a giant in the region. There was no competitors to it. They got overtaken by the Mongols once, and then the Manchus once, but they just absorbed them into that system. They became part of the system. So China didn't have that competitive dynamic. So it's the competitive dynamic that's central to it. And it also had a very strong interest in suppressing capitalism, because that was a threat to its own power.
Oh, Bruce, did you want to ask your question, or should I read it out? Oh, I think you're still muted.
I thought Naomi got in ahead of me, didn't she?
Yeah, but I think your question was about what stopped China becoming capitalist.
No, not me.
Oh, Naomi, sorry. Go on, Naomi.
No.
Oh, mine was just in the chat about, so we were talking about the relationship between capitalism and markets, and then I was also asking about the relationship between state and capitalism. Just a bit more unpacking on that.
So capitalism and markets, and capitalism and the state. Yeah, cool. Okay. So so capitalism has always taken place through the mechanism of markets from the very beginning. So in Europe, so if we locate its origins really in Venice and Genoa, they're commercial economies. So they begin and they use markets to do their thing. And every form of capitalism, whether it's trading, for spices or silks or things like that, or whether it's later on industrialization and the industrial that's using markets for an industrial system, or whether it's finance, which from the beginning has always been about financial markets. Markets have been at the center of capitalism. So it needs markets, it uses markets. But it also tends to undermine markets because, and this was Adam Smith's very argument, because for markets to be healthy, it's the whole, you need lots of players. And that was here. So China was the model, the pin-up poster child of a large market with lots of small players and no one who's completely outweighing the other. Whereas in capitalism, what arises is these massive players. So we can, look at the world of digital technology now, the Amazons, the Googles and Facebook, they're these giants. Or look at the world of supermarkets in Australia, so Woolworths and Coles, in mining, these again and again, these minings who undermine the basically the social outcomes of markets, because they basically have their economic interests are able to take precedence once you gain that sort of weight within a market. So does that get to some of how they undermine markets?
And then you said that the state's the biggest threat to capitalism, but also reliant upon it. So, yeah.
So let's start with reliant on, because the modern states, and so when I'm saying modern states, the states that really arose from the 16th century and which really solidified by the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. That's really, we talk about the birth of the modern state system in 1648. Modern states really rose needing to raise capital from capitalists. They were literally going to the big financiers and the big merchants, needing to pay for their money, to get loans, to pay for their armies, for their militaries. And in order to do so, those capitalists were wanting increasing surety from states because they saw them as real risks. So they said, if we're going to loan to you, you go show us you've got a good economic system that just like when you go for a house loan, that bank wants to know you've got the income. So that meant states needed to tighten up their revenue raising. So we see that particularly happening. The revolution happens most strongly in Britain with the beginning of the Bank of England and its raising of revenue through, and basically its mandate to raise revenue for the government and the whole taxation system that then develops. And they have a very solid system then to pay for their military industrial complex, that imperial complex that Britain has from then on. So the states need those financial systems. So they need the capitalists, but also capitalists, the state is the biggest threat. So the biggest example of that is in the 19th century, when you have labor movements beginning to challenge, the social movements challenge capitalist dominance, and you have political parties arising in the Western world who get into power in Australia, in Britain, Labor parties, and they begin to want to use the powers of the state to rein back this thing called capitalism. And actually, for the first part of the 20th century, they have do an amazing job. There are some people who think by the end of the Second World War that capitalism is on its last throes. That it's going to die soon. They were pretty wrong, but in historical terms, it gives you a picture that there's been backwards. It hasn't just been one direction. And so the state is a player that can weigh against capitalism, and that's always been understood. So it can be aligned with it, and it can also be seen as a threat to it. And it all just depends on how things play.
Cool. Now we'll throw to you, Bruce. Sorry, Naomi. I had that same question as well.
My question just is, this is not really historical so much as definitional, and you jump from people who didn't define capitalism, Marx, Weber, and so on, to a definition under a world systems theory definition. But you say to begin with that the definition is disputed. It's a disputed one. So I'm wondering what are some of the competing ones, and how come whenever I talk about capitalism, I get this allergic reaction from economists, as if either your definition is totally unacceptable or even using the word is unacceptable. Do you want to say anything about other definitions that are around the place?
Yeah, sure. So those three were definitions of cap. So Marx, Marx's definition, which is, so some people would, and even non-Marxists, but mostly Marxists, would take a working definition of capitalism as a mode of production based on the proletarianization of labor. That is the alienation of labor from their means of production and from their product, i.e. industrialization. So that's a Marxist definition of capitalism. If you're looking for capitalism history, you're looking for that sort of industrial structure to an economy. If it's an agrarian economy, then it can't be capitalism, or just a commercial economy. So a quote unquote Smithian definition, that's people who see themselves as followers of Adam Smith, but who often I think are misconstruing him, would see capitalism as a system of free trade. Let it rip. So capitalism, is a system in which markets have maximum liberty to do their thing. So that would be so that definition. The Weberian definition of capitalism is much more complex. I won't try and define, but I try to bring it down to his focusing on capitalism as a rationality, as a way of thinking. You are right that economists are generally allergic to the term capitalism, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is because actually very few economists ever do any economic history at all in their whole economics degree. So there's very little, most are woefully ignorant of economic history. Many think about, so I've heard quite senior economists use capitalism as a synonym just for economics. So often, if you're talking about capitalism and you're speaking about it critically, they think you're talking about the discipline of economics in basically a polemic and derogatory way, rather than describing this thing that has arisen in history and can be pointed to at a certain time and place and having certain characteristics and a certain story to it. So that's the problem. And so perhaps what I'm suggesting tonight, that the underlying message behind all of this is, if you're going to use the term capitalism, you need to define what you mean by it. Even to some extent, it doesn't even matter what the definition that you give to it. At least make clear when you're about to launch into talking about capitalism what you mean by the term. Now, as I presented, I think there are better and worse ways of using that term. Some ways which make sense, and some more sense, and some ways which make less sense. So just using it as a synonym for market economies makes no sense, because, well, we've got a better term for that, market economies. Why talk about capitalism? If we just use it as a synonym for commerce, well, that's unhelpful, because we just talk about commerce. Likewise, and so on and so forth. Does that go to your question, Bruce?
Yeah, I think so. Yep.
Cool. Clint, am I to take you as wanting me to read out your question? Yeah. So Clint's question is, what kept capitalism in check in Europe before its rise to dominance? Was capitalism inevitable given humanity's or our desire for more money and more power and power of money?
Okay. So what kept it in check, and was it inevitable?
Given human desire for power, money, and the power of money.
So I do not think it was inevitable. This is an interesting question. We could have had a whole section, particularly in talking about Marx. A lot of people, and both on the critics of capitalism and those who are pro-capitalism, think about it in what are called teleological terms. That is, capitalism is something. Teleology means describes the end point of history, where history is going to. That it is something that is inevitable, that is going to arise. So the so-called Smithians, who aren't really representing Adam Smith, often speak about capitalism. They talk about why capitalism arose in England first, as if it was always going to happen somewhere, and why the English were the first. And actually, the English weren't. That's their mistaken view of economic history. But anyway, they'll say why it happened there first, as if it was inevitable to happen somewhere, and they just the task is to discover why they got there first. But someone was always going to get there. I don't think that's the case, simply because historically, I think what I was trying to convey is the story of how it happens is really a whole mess of historical accidents by virtue of just what Europe is. It has a lot to do with that, just the economic and political shape of Europe. So there have been commercial economies, quite sophisticated and advanced ones, at various points in history: the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, the China for a long time, the Mughal Empire, Islam. And none of them developed capitalism. Europe developed capitalism before it got to a level of sophistication of some of those other economies. It wasn't the level of sophistication, it was just the internal dynamics as what was happening. Now, what should be the disturbing question for us was it was Christian Europe that this happened in, and what is the relationship, and that will be the question for another night, what is the relationship between Christianity in that mix and capitalism? But I think it was, to a short answer to your question, an accident, and I think it will end. So I think it's a system that has a date. It began sometime, and it probably will end sometime. It's not the end point of history, as some people have argued.
Fantastic. And we've got just time for Ramsey House right at the end. Do you want to ask your question, or should I read it out?
Our question was, why is capitalism not merely an ideology like neoliberalism?
Right. Okay. So firstly, good question. Firstly, the key point there is because no one thought it up. So it's not something that someone dreamed up. So neoliberalism is an ideology that dreamed up by Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman and a bunch of other people who sat and talked together and wrote lots of stuff and came up with these. It's essentially a political ideology to describe the world that they want to see. Whereas capitalism, what I'm using is capitalism is a world that has happened, irrespective what any sort of ideology that someone came up with. No one designed it. No one orchestrated it. There was no conspiracy behind it. It wasn't even an intellectual development. It was this whole, over a period of centuries, historical accidents building up. The ideologies come in with the people who basically want to justify the system. So neoliberalism is a form of justifying or apologetic for a form of capitalism, for either justifying a world that we have or arguing for we want a more capitalist world in a particular shape. So that's the distinction between the two. And neoliberalism doesn't actually describe how capitalism behaves. So in pure neoliberal theory, the market, if you leave markets go in the world as they currently exist, they will, in the current capitalist world, they will tend towards competition and perfect competition, and the outcomes will be good. But actually, historically, and we can see this again and again in the world, the way capitalism behaves is towards monopoly, is to move inexorably again and again in that direction until something shakes it up, like a government coming in here or there. And monopolies are bad for markets. So there's an example.
Cool. That's all our questions. We're pretty much bang on time, John. Well done. You can watch the second half.
Great. So there's the second half of the State of Origin waiting there. Thanks for joining us, folks. Looking forward to seeing some of you, I hope, for the next one, which is thinking about the capitalism and the principalities and powers, terminology from the New Testament. And we're going to be thinking about that thing I've just described. We're going to be thinking about it in theological and biblical terms. So, thanks and goodbye.